words, Emily. May I live up to them? And thank you to ESR, to Della and Katrina for having me here today. So as Emily says, I do spend a great deal of my daytimes thinking about these things and have some thoughts to share. If I do full screen, well, let me do read mode. Is that reasonably sized, Emily?
Yes, looks good and lots of nods.
So in addition to being executive director of the Friends Center in Philadelphia, I am a member of Green Street Monthly Meeting, part of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Shown above left, we have a wonderful magnolia tree in the front yard that every April showers us with blessings. Early 20th century construction, so familiar with that kind of meeting house. But before moving to Philadelphia, I was a member of San Francisco Monthly Meeting and Pacific Yearly Meeting, and was the clerk of the property committee there for a couple of years, and then clerk of meeting. This is kind of an old photo because American Friends Service Committee no longer has offices in the San Francisco Meeting House. They moved to Oakland some years back, but this is the photo that's still on the meeting website. So that's where I borrowed that from. And they do have some tenancy in the second floor, as well as renting the main meeting space on the first floor to outside groups. And then over here on the right is the Friends Center in the heart of Center City, Philadelphia. We have about 50,000 square feet of office space, which we lease to nonprofit organizations, both Quaker groups and organizations whose missions advance Quaker values or causes we care about, like social justice, criminal justice, education, and many more. We have the National Historic Landmark Race Street Meeting House on the campus, built in 1856 as the Hicksite Yearly Meeting House. And now this is sort of our iconic view from our green roof. The whole building was renovated to the LEED Platinum Green standard in 2009. So that was before my time. I can't take credit for that, but we are stewarding our resources as best we can. And we do have one of the 3 copies of Sylvia Judson's statue of Mary Dyer on campus. And one of them, of course, is also at Earlham. And then here's just a different view of the meeting house. So it's because it was the yearly meeting site, it is quite large. It is used weekly by Friends Select School, which is a block away and now shares part of our campus. Has their graduations there. Other Delaware Valley Friends schools, some charter schools have graduations there, and AFSC has its annual corporation meeting. So it's a complex, thriving place and lots of different types of rentals. So I'll be speaking from my experience in these different aspects today, and we will have time for some breakouts so folks can compare notes and share their own experiences and bring up their own questions. So I hope that Emily, when Emily referred to in part our spiritual practices, so stewardship of property and opening our doors to others is, to me, an important ministry of the Society of Friends, especially since most of us have facilities that are not used every day of the week. So I really like this image of the meeting house with the open doors. So just to preview, my talk will be in 4 parts. So your meeting wants to rent some space, and from the introductory chat, it's clear many of you are already doing so in various ways. We'll think a bit about what goes into creating rental policies. I have several practical considerations for you to mull over, and then toward right relationship with the folks using our spaces. And these all call back to the queries for the session that when you registered, you would have read, what does right relationship mean when we have tenants? I'm actually coming to that last because I want to set up the framework of the relationship first. Starting with, to whom do we rent and why? How do we create rental policies? How do we work with tenants that misrent or violate the rental policy? And what you'll see is my philosophy is have a relationship that's such you'll be able to do that work. And it's always challenging, it's difficult, but if you have an existing relationship and framework, it is possible. So you want to rent some space. If you are not doing this now, then the first thing to think about is why. And there could be many reasons why. The space is not used during the week and could be used. There may be needs in your community that you want to help address, such as food or shelter. Perhaps someone actively approached you about using your space. And in the case where some kind of donation or a fee or actual rent is paid, then it's income towards the meeting or Friends Church budget as well. So it is worth knowing why you really want to do this before jumping off. And then, so I'm going through the 5 W's, why and what. So what kind of rental do you want? And Emily asked, and people responded, would this be one-off events, perhaps regular meetings, such as for a 12-step group or a meditation group that meets weekly or monthly, or singing group? Or do you have office space that you're not using and you could lease? Then the other W question next is when, meaning when will the space be available? Just occasionally for events? Or is it a group that meets weekly or monthly? Is this something that can happen on weekdays because you're really only using the space during the weekend? And then we need to think about, is the same space being used at different times? Is it a shared space? Or does somebody have exclusive use of it around the clock, or 24/7? The next question is where? Where in your facility do you have space? What specific space? And there was a range, again, in the responses from just the meeting room to a side building to the basement. So be clear about what is on the table. And then who? So do you have an ideal renter? Is it a community-based group? Is it an incorporated nonprofit? Is it an individual who has a leading that the meeting supports? Later, I'll talk about due diligence when you actually find people willing to use your space as a renter, and what you ought to think about before moving ahead. And the second who question really is for your meeting or church. Who has the authority to decide to enter into an agreement? Presumably, most of us would go to monthly meeting before we would say, yes, we're gonna, especially if it's gonna be a lease, you want unity, I think, in the community before you move ahead. But it could be as simple as, oh yes, we'd like to open up the worship room to suitable groups on an occasional basis for a minimal donation or fee. And then to whom will you delegate actually working out the details? Is that a property committee, a finance committee? And then the other piece of it is who's going to work on the operational details, who's going to maintain the space. Some of the folks are asking the group that uses their space to clean up afterwards, and that, in a sense, is their donation. But do you have a cleaning service? Do friends in your community come in and take care of the space? So with additional people comes additional wear and tear, and you just need to be ready for that to happen. So I think if you can answer the who, what, where, when, and why, you have the basics to create a rental policy. And you'll need more details on many of those things. But to me, that's really the high level um, content that will go into a policy for use of your space. The next step then would be actually, if you're not already renting space, to think about how do you reach the people who you want to be your renters. If you have a specific group in mind, it may be as simple as, you know, approaching the community food pantry about, hey, we've got this space. Would you like to use it? Let's talk. Or do you need to be more generic? Do you need to go to a neighborhood association or a neighborhood group on Facebook or something like that? Are there networks of community-based or faith-based organizations in your community where you could let them know, you know, friends really want this space to be available? The second piece is once you've identified potential users, you need to think about what do you know about them and are they suitable? Are their values aligned with your meetings or church's values? And for the most part, I think that's pretty straightforward. I'm coming from a place where we have 30 different nonprofit groups renting our space. So every time we lease space to a new group, we look at their mission statement, we look at their financial statements online, and guidestar.org is a resource that has the IRS Form 990 reports for all 501c3 nonprofits. So if that's somebody you're potentially interested in a long-term financial relationship with, GuideStore is a really good resource for that. But, you know, for the most part, if it's a 12-step group, a singing group, or the like, you don't need to do a whole lot of discernment necessarily. But I do like to recommend that you at least consider it and make sure that if for some reason somebody complained about this group, you'd be ready to say, no, we thought about this. They are aligned with our values and we appreciate them and support them and to be able to move on. I strongly recommend having a written agreement, and I'll get into the details of what often is good to have in a written agreement. Again, it varies. If it's a very casual kind of use, it may not be necessary, but certainly if it's a regular, reoccurring activity, I think a written agreement just helps prevent misunderstandings later. Or, you know, you're not having to go back through some email thread of 30 different emails and say, oh, on October 12th, you said you were going to do such and such and you never did. And if it's just agreed to up front, it makes it a lot easier. Something that can be helpful is to assist with move-in. So obviously, if they need keys to the space, you have to make sure they get that. If there are access codes or alarm codes, just not dropping the ball on the details of getting the folks into the space. Or if it's an event rental, making sure someone from the meeting or church is ready to meet them at the door and let them in on the day of. And this came to me as I was writing my notes, like celebrate, like be happy that you found somebody and that you're going to be embarking on this relationship together. So for example, could somebody from the group come to your monthly meeting for business and share a little bit about what they're doing? Could you have a little reception to say, welcome and offer hospitality? So I'm not sure I really do that in practice very well, but it's something I want to maybe experiment with. So now I've talked quite a bit, and let's give you some time to think about these things. I'm going to hand it back to Emily to set up some breakout groups.
And don't stop the screen share yet, Chris. Friends, usually in these trainings, we do one breakout session. We're going to do two this time, so it will be quick. You're going to find yourself in a group of 4 or 5 friends for about 8 minutes. And there are two sets of queries because some of you are early in the discernment process and others of you have been doing this for a long time. So I recommend you either quickly jot your queries down or take a photo of them with your phone, or maybe you just know you will remember. Some of you will just remember. If you meet somebody in this small group that you like or that you think you would like to follow up with and have more conversation, swap contact details while you're there. And some of you have been asking about an opt-in contact sheet. And that's on my list of something to be working on within the next couple of weeks, but we are not there yet. So I will send you off momentarily to your group and we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes time. Just popping a couple last people into groups as they've been coming in. We'll see you in a little bit. Chris or Katrina or Della, I didn't put you in groups, but you can go to one if you want to. So let me know if you'd like to.
I will probably pass. I have gone into a sneezing and coughing fit, which is why I've been off screen because it's like, oh my goodness.
Okay.
So I will be here.
Okay.
Think I will continue eating my sandwich.
Okay. Sounds like a plan.
And I'm gonna run to the restroom.
Well, I'll be right here.
Thank you.
Hmm. I think, yeah, I'm noticing that our friend with Judy Reese as the name, nothing has happened. Do you see something to click on to go? There you go. And Marvea, I can't tell if you're there or if you've stepped away. But if you're there and you're confused, let me know.
Emily, I thought the chat was a really effective way to do that information gathering. So
Good,
thank
I'm
you for
glad.
that.
Are you seeing a message that says Geraldine Brannon in room 6 asked for help?
No, I'm not seeing that.
Hmm.
I think maybe that's just because
Well, it
okay,
says-
Della, I got your message, which is not that. And
I'm- Yeah, I'm not seeing anything either, so I'm wondering if it only goes to you as host, Katrina.
Okay.
yeah, I
Well,
think that's it.
I'm gonna jump in. It says I could join their breakout room, so I'll jump in there and see.
Okay, they might just want to know the questions again.
I'm gonna run downstairs and get more water so that I can hopefully stop coughing, so I will be right back.
Okay. Interesting. I assume everything was okay.
The person, Geraldine Brannon, was not in that room. And it was 3 men and they were happily talking on topic. So
That's really odd because according to what I'm looking at, Geraldine Brannon is in that room, which makes me
Huh.
think she's lost in the ether somewhere. I have
Huh.
no idea what
There-
happened to her.
there were
Oh, no.
3 men.
Because that's what it looks like to me too. It's like,
That is so weird. I wonder where she is. I bet
Huh.
she wonders where she is too.
I felt so sad. It says Geraldine Brannon is asking for help in room 6.
I bet she is.
I can't find her.
Oh dear. All right, well, hopefully she'll come back when everybody else does.
Also, a bald eagle flew over past my window, and now I really need to go find it
Wow,
after the meeting.
cool.
A
That's
pair
neat.
of them came through here last year and landed in the neighbor's tree for a couple days. So
All right, everybody will be back in 45 seconds, except possibly the eagle. Welcome back to the early birds. Everybody else will be popping back in about 30 seconds.
Emily, I feel like we're doing well on time. Would it be okay to take a minute and just have people share a little bit?
Absolutely. Do you want to ask that question or do you want me to?
I could try. Feel free to amend.
First of all, welcome back, friends. And secondly, just quickly, apologies to Geraldine, who I don't know what happened to you, but you were lost in the ether somehow. So I'm glad to see your name came back to the main room, and let's hope that doesn't happen again. I'm glad to see you back. And Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I think we're doing pretty well on time. So I wondered if folks had something that came up for them that was like a high priority based on this initial discussion. Any quick thoughts?
I have a question. I came on late and missed your introduction and went straight into the breakout room. And I'm from Durango. We have a small meeting house and we are asked from time to time to rent space to groups. And we also have a small college and maybe in a position to take in a student to rent some space for a while. And I just wondered if there are rules regarding how much income we can take in and retain our status, nonprofit status.
Great question, and I will get to that in the next section, so you didn't miss
Okay,
that.
great, thank you.
There's probably time for Susan and then Darlene, and then there will be more Q&A at the end.
We have been renting for quite a long time, but one of the questions that I have has to do with insurance and your relationship to your insurance carriers. Are you going to talk about that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Also, I'm wondering about, they said on the rentor side that the current clerk would be the responsible person on the rentor side, and that changes, frequently. So how do you establish that relationship with the group? And do you change that as you go along, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, you have to change that as you go along. Not necessarily in terms of signatures on the original document, but in terms of everybody having each other's contact info. And I'll actually address that in the next section as well. So with that may be a good segue to part 2. Thinking about the operational details. So again, my position is best to have a written agreement that the meeting or church will sign and the renter will sign. If it has the authority of the monthly meeting behind it, it doesn't matter, if the clerk changes after a while, if you've set that length or set that agreement for a certain length, that's fine. That person could change even though the relationship hasn't. So the first thing to think about is the term of the agreement. So is this for a specific date or dates, or a recurring date, the second Tuesday of every month from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., whatever it might be? Or if it is a lease, if you have some office space or a meeting room that someone's going to have exclusive use of, then you should be clear on what the start date is and the end date. And that doesn't mean it has to end at the end of that term, but it gives you a chance to really revisit, is this relationship working? Do we wish to continue? And it's a natural way to part ways if, for whatever reason, the meeting feels like, yeah, this isn't what we really wanted. But you can always renew it. We do that with a simple letter, basically extending leases for another 12 months. In our case, you may wish to choose something different. And especially if it's a lease and not just about events, to be clear what kind of notice you have to give them or they have to give you. So, a typical apartment lease would require 30 days notice. We tend to do 60 days just to give the organizations some time. And then also we raise our rent annually, except at the first part of COVID because nobody was here. So I try to give notice of the next year's increase with at least 1 month and preferably 2 months, just so they have time to adapt in their budgets. And for events, if you are charging a fee, we have a very clear fee schedule. It's posted on our website. We always give nonprofit groups a 20% discount automatically, and something like 80 to 85% of the groups that rent Friends Center space are nonprofits. And we haven't increased our prices for that in quite a while, but we probably will do so later this year and probably without a whole lot of notice. But in some cases, we have said as a marketing tool, oh, our prices are going up January 1st. If you book your event this fall for next year, you could still get this year's rate. And so helping people recognize the value of the space by charging what it's worth. Speaking of which, then the rent. So what is the price or the rental fee if it's an event? If it's an ongoing relationship, do they pay monthly, quarterly? If it's an event, do they need to pay in advance? Is it due on the 1st of the month or anytime before the event? Be clear on where the payment has to go. So for example, if you have a volunteer treasurer who takes care of the books and that person changes, then the people who are renting your space need to know when there's a change so they can adjust their payment. And do you accept more than paper checks? So increasingly people want to be able to use ACH for electronic fund transfer from their bank, or electronic bill pay online, PayPal, or the like. So do you have any systems set up to allow people to do that? You may want to require a security deposit. I would say that really depends on the nature of the relationship. If it's some third party you really are not super familiar with, you may well want the security deposit. In our case for event rentals, if people are booking well in advance, we ask for an advance of half, and then the other half is due close to the event. And that's just a way to say, we're saving the space for you. We want you to be earnest about that. And so we require that upfront money. If for some reason they have to cancel, I think they have up until 48 hours before the event to cancel, they'll get their money back. But it just shows a good faith effort on their part that, yes, they really do want the space. Please don't rent it out to somebody else in the meantime. I've also heard it said, for a security deposit, if it's an organization you know well, or maybe someone from your meeting or church is involved and you just feel like we don't need that, or there's really a low risk of damage to the property, you don't have to have a security deposit. Similarly, penalty for late payments. So if you feel like you might need to incentivize people to be on time, you could consider having a penalty. If you're due on the 1st of the month that you don't pay by the 15th, you might assess a small fee, or maybe a 30-day grace period. I think on paper we have late payment fees, but in practice we don't generally assess them, because we're working with groups we know, they're doing really good work in the world, and sometimes their bookkeeper misses a payment or something, and they're always good for it. So we don't really pursue those late fees. It helps to be as specific as you can about what space is covered by your agreement. So if the name of the room or the building, if you're doing a long-term lease, I would recommend a written description of the space. And if you have one, a floor plan. So in our case, for each tenant, we drop a little floor plan. And partly that's because we have this open plan office suite design. And so groups are sharing workstations right next to each other, cubicles. And we have to be clear, like, no, this is your cubicle and that's their cubicle. So every now and then we talk about more of a co-working kind of space where people could drop in and just take any available desk, but we're not there yet. And then, as referenced earlier, is the space being used by others as well, or is it exclusive to that group? I think that's sometimes where conflicts can happen. Oh, the kitchen. Well, is the kitchen available to the outside group or not? Or is it just for the meeting? If it is shared between you and the outside group, what are your expectations about how that space will be kept? Do you need to provide certain services? So will the Wi-Fi in the building be accessible to people who are there? And if you are offering office space, will you provide mail service? Will they be able to get a phone line? And then to incorporate that in your agreement. This is really more towards a lease rather than just an event. But if you are a landlord, then you need to furnish utilities like electricity, water, and heat, and in some cases, air conditioning. If you maintain and clean the building, it's helpful to say you will do that. A phrase that we have in our standard lease is that we will allow the renter quiet enjoyment of their space, meaning we're not going to barge in or interrupt them in the course of when they're in their space doing their thing. And meanwhile, the renter has responsibilities as well to follow your guidelines for building use, to keep the space generally tidy, and to report maintenance issues to you promptly so that you can take care of them. And insurance was asked about. So in particular, if you're leasing space, I would recommend that to an organization that's incorporated, if they have insurance, then ideally they would name your meeting or church as an additional insured on their policy. And if they are able to do that, you may want to look at your own coverage and consider, do you need a minimum? So for example, Friends Center has a minimum policy coverage of $1 million per incident, and I think $2 million aggregate, something like that. You may want to talk to your insurance provider. In our case, our insurance provider is actually Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and the Friends Insurance Group. So that works pretty well for us. And there's an outside agent that manages that plan. So we just make that standard in our agreements. A little side note for events, if you really are doing events often with a variety of groups that you may or may not know well, we've taken out something called TULIP, which is tenant and user liability insurance policy. It's basically a 30-day policy that anybody could purchase. So we even do it for weddings or family events. If an individual is renting the meeting house here, we have them buy a TULIP policy. It's another $100 per occurrence. And then I think we pay $2,000 a year. Most Quaker meetings or churches are not going to need that level of coverage, but if you have a robust rental business, you might want to think about it. So speeding along here, we're ready for our next breakout. And Emily, can you describe this one?
Absolutely. Friends, you're going to have about the same amount of time in this second conversation, but you are also going to meet new people. So again, feel free to exchange contact info. When we come back, you'll hear a little bit more content, and Chris will cover communications, taxes, and relationships. And then we'll have a question and answer session in the large group at the end. So that's what to expect when you come back. I'm pausing for just one more minute because I see a lot of people looking up and down and writing queries down. And I don't want to send you off to groups right in the middle of you doing that.
Unless we can put them quick in the chat, but going from PDF to that might be hard.
Yeah, I think they've about got it.
Okay.
Friends, we'll see you back in just a few minutes before we hit the top of the hour. Welcome back, everybody. Chris, I think we're all here.
Okay. Well, welcome back. And I'm going to just move into the next section, and then we will have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So the queries for this session talked about when facing challenges, what do we do? So part of it is to go into that with a sense of acceptance almost that things will happen. It's normal. We're all human. We all make mistakes. And so the question is, how will we respond when something happens that someone is unhappy with one way or another? And just to be ready, to be in that state of openness and inquiry and wondering like, oh, this thing happened. Now what shall we do? So I do have some thoughts though about setting up some guidelines, some structures and guardrails for assisting us in addressing those situations. And my number one thing is creating clear channels of communication. I mean, at the very micro level, I'm thinking of times at yearly meeting sessions, both the Pacific yearly meeting and Philadelphia yearly meeting, where I was in the children's program for a while and helping out there. And so the way things were transmitted by word of mouth didn't always work well for everybody. It's a little different now that we have texts and group texts and so on, but it seemed like a lot of the friction that ever came up in those annual sessions was around failure to communicate and not anticipating a need to do so. So on your side, who in your congregation is responsible for routine care and cleaning? What happens if the garbage can is overfull when the renter arrives and they're distressed by this? Who do they pass their feedback on to? Or if there are maintenance issues, if the toilet overflows. And this hits close to home for me because when I was clerk of property committee for San Francisco meeting, we didn't have a building manager. And every now and then I'd get a call from the AFSC office saying, well, our toilet is stopped up. Could you come and address it? So I'd have to leave my job, which happened to be also within walking distance, and come over and see what I could do or see if we needed to call somebody. So it works better if there's somebody who is flexible or whose job it is to do these kinds of maintenance issues so that they can be fixed promptly. But also, who's the contact? If your main contact, say it's your property committee clerk, is away or not able to respond quickly, can your renter call somebody else? Who else? Is there some kind of phone tree that they can use, or a group text? And that's especially true for friends meetings that don't have any staff. You're all volunteers, and you may forget to, when you're going on the vacation you're very excited about, you may forget that, oh, the singing group might have an issue on Tuesday night and they're going to need to call the assistant clerk while I'm away. Similarly, any financial or contractual issues, who's the main point of contact? Is it your finance committee clerk, your treasurer? If questions come up, or who's tracking the payments? What if they are late in the payment? Whose job is it to follow up and talk to your renter about that? Similarly, on your side, you need the renter's contact information and their backups. If you have issues with them, you come in on Sunday and the kitchen is a complete mess, and what happened and why did they leave it like that? Who are you going to call? And if the main contact isn't available, is there someone else? So, and then another layer of that is then who in the meeting needs to know their info? Is it the whole property committee? But you also don't want to overdo it so that your poor renter gets suddenly besieged by 35 friends with an issue, all sending them emails or texts at once. So anyway, just your solution will work for you, but to actually think about it before there's an issue, so you can then use that as your approach and you can tweak it as you need to. If you are sharing space, that you have different users in the same space at different times, some kind of calendar to track that usage is critical. Ideally, if you can make it viewable to both or all parties. I mean, many meetings have the calendar of events on their website, and so you're already doing that, and that's great. But to consider who has access to the calendar and can make those changes, and making sure more than one friend has the password to that account. Because I've been in meetings where the person responsible for setting up the Google Calendar or what have you has moved on or is not in that position or has moved away. And nobody knows how to recover that. And suddenly you not only have to recreate a new calendar, you have to connect it to your website and so on. So just being thoughtful going into the process can really help. And just to bring up at a high level, so tax issues, and it was asked early on about nonprofit status and income. So this may be a matter where you need to talk to an accountant or a lawyer, depending on the amount of income that you might be bringing in and whether it really is a fee for service or just a donation. Pay as you wish. The way we address it is by our mission is, maybe I should take a step back. Friend Center is a special case, so I'll say more about that in a second. But in general, if you are providing space to organizations whose values align with Friends, or doing work in the community that you support and is in line with your mission as a spiritual community, to me, that seems like it's within the safe harbor for the IRS purposes. If you're renting to a for-profit business, though, that could be different. If you're renting space to a childcare center, that could be on the bubble. I mean, some childcare centers are nonprofit, some are for-profit, but they don't really make very much money. And so care for children is a value of Friends, therefore it might well be within your mission. So I want to bring this up to say, you need to think about it. Oh, and I recall in the chat early on, someone mentioned renting part of a property for residential use. And so that is creating property tax issues. So in Philadelphia, nonprofits are exempt from property tax as long as we're using our space for mission-related purposes. And so like a parsonage or something like that is mission-related. It's space for your pastor. But if it's space for a member of Quaker Voluntary Service, maybe that isn't. I don't know. That your mileage may vary. You should check. There may be legal issues. So for example, is your property allowed to have residential uses? Is it zoned that way? Do any building codes need to be looked at? Are you in compliance with them? And you know, what may be okay for a sort of church or religious related use might be different if it's a business or commercial or residential use. So just to be clear on what the regulatory framework is for your situation. And then in keeping with the idea of having a written agreement separate from that, building use policy or guidelines. So that would be more the operational details. Here's when the trash gets picked up. Here are expectations about, you know, when something goes wrong or a maintenance issue comes up. So a lot of what I've already talked about could just be compiled into a set of guidelines that just helps everybody with clarity and in communication. And if people change, then the documents stay there and survive, you know, that initial startup. There was a charismatic founder of some group that got, you know, the relationship going, and the clerk of the meeting knew that person, and it all went great. And then now you have a new clerk, and the founder of that group has moved on. And so at that point, having written guidelines really helps. But stewarding that relationship. So that's where I'm headed as we reach the end of our time, that again, these wrinkles and bumps are normal. Don't be surprised, or any one of them might surprise you, like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, but don't be shocked. Like, how could that have happened? Well, things happen. So how do you address them? So if you have that ongoing connection, human to human, it's a lot easier, because then you can pick up the phone or send a text and say, hey, can we talk? Can we go have coffee or tea and work through this together? So that's part of why keeping that contact info current is really critical. As I was saying a moment ago, sometimes when everybody's really excited and the meeting is just really happy to have the space available for this new use, everybody's on board, but then other causes arise, people's focus shifts elsewhere, personnel change, and that relationship can atrophy if you're not stewarding it as you go. So the written agreement becomes the backup. Then you've got something to point to say, hey, we all agreed to this. What happened on your side? Tell me more. Let's maintain the integrity of our relationship by talking through this together. And if we need to rewrite the agreement, okay, we'll rewrite the agreement too. But hey, if you've fallen short or we've fallen short, let's find a way to get together and talk through that. Feel like there's more I could say, but I also want you all to hear from one another, or have a chance to ask some questions.